So we're going to revise the whole of politics and participation using the Knowledge Organisers. So if we look to start with, then at the top we've got different types of government, and the main important one you need to know is what democracy is. So we live in a democracy, which basically means people have got the right to choose their government, and they choose their government by voting. So it says in a democracy that all people are equal and collectively hold power. Part of that is to have regular and fair elections. So in this country, our general elections usually take place every 5 years, can be more often, as has been in the past few years. And the fact they're fair, you're not bullied into voting for somebody, you're not bribed, as used to happen previously. Opportunities for all voters to participate. So in this country, you've got to be over 18, and if you remember some of the other restrictions, you can't vote if you're in prison, you can't vote under certain items on the Mental Health Act and things like that. So is that fair? And you could have an 8-mark question on whether prisoners should be allowed to vote, thinking about moulding them back into society, making them active participants in society to help them feel less marginalised and therefore less likely to commit crimes. But then if they've taken human rights away from other people, should they have their human rights met? You also might have questions on whether 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote. So you guys will leave school very shortly, and basically you're not going to be able to vote for another couple of years. Is that fair? Remembering that the people who are least likely to vote are the 18 even to 24-year-olds. These guys are the future. It's them who should be voting. So would votes at 16, when you learn about it in school, would that help? Or at 16 and 17, are you too immature to choose who should run the country? We've also got a chance for citizens to stand for election, so anybody can become an MP. But you've got to be voted in, obviously, but an everyday person can join a political party and stand for election. Same within local councils as well. You can become a local councillor. You're not born into it. So that's a really important part of democracy. Freedom for the media to report on the work of the government. So this really comes in as well into the Life in Modern Britain unit that we've just been studying. The media can report on, MPs can report on what the government is doing. They can disagree with it. If you were to live in a dictatorship somewhere like North Korea, the media cannot disagree with the government. If they do, they're going to end up with serious consequences. In this country, we can hold our government to account, and part of that is through the media. So if you look at how the media have reported how the government have acted over the coronavirus, and questioning them not condemning Dominic Cummings for his breaking of the social distancing rules, we're allowed to do that in this country, and it's a massive important part of it. Think about the MP's expenses scandal and all those kind of things. We've then got a separate legal system that can hold the government accountable. So if you remember, our big thing that we looked at was when the Parliament was prorogued, and the fact that they actually got taken to the Supreme Court. In a non-democratic country, you could never ever take your government to court. So again, it's a really important part of democracy, the people holding power. So there's two different types of democracy that we're looking at. We've got direct democracy, which is where every single person votes on everything. Now, we don't have a direct democracy in this country, but we have got examples of it. So when we had the referendum, the vote on one issue with the Brexit referendum in 2016, where people decided on one issue, that is an example of direct democracy. However, in this country, we live in a representative democracy, which is where our MPs represent us in Parliament, and they vote within the votes in Parliament on our behalf, which is why it's important you can contact your MP. So for example, I email my MP all the time, say my points of view, and hopefully they'll discuss that with me and represent my views in Parliament. The values of living in a democracy are really related to our British values, so our freedoms, the rule of law, that nobody is above the law. So even if you're the Prime Minister, you are still under the rule of law. Human rights have to be held up, and also equality. Opposition to this will be something like a dictatorship. So that is where there is one person or a group of people who are in control of the country. They're not voted in. They maintain control usually by force and by fear. Human rights very often aren't met. And there are lots of issues with things like the legal system, which is controlled by the government, so you haven't got that separation of powers. The media is very tightly controlled by the government, so if you think about places like China or North Korea, where they don't have access to the internet very readily. Another one you could have is theocracy, and this is where religious figures are the government. So, for example, the Vatican. So, if we think about our government and our parliament, we've got to look at parliament structure. There are three parts to our parliament. So, the main one is the House of Commons. The House of Commons is where the MPs go. There are 650 MPs who all represent a constituency or an area. And basically what usually happens is the party who've got the most MPs become the government and form a government. Not always the case, but that's generally how it works. The House of Commons has elected MPs, so we vote them in. Therefore, they are the most powerful part of our parliament. The other house in the House of Houses of Parliament is the House of Lords. Now, the Lords are not elected, therefore they cannot have as much power. So if the MPs in the House of Commons want to pass a law through and the House of Lords can't agree to it, they have got the power to do that. It can't happen the other way around because of the fact we live in a democracy. The House of Lords, now some of the Lords are Lords because their parents and their grandparents were Lords. However, a lot of them have been chosen by the Prime Minister because they are experts in their field. So, for example, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, he asked Sir Lord Sugar to become a Lord because he was an expert in business. So you have experts in science, in business, in transport, etc., who are asked to become Lords. And then the last part of the Parliament is the monarch, the King or Queen. And again, they're not elected. They open and close Parliament ceremonially once a year, and they also pass off laws as well. So they sign off laws, and again the House of Commons has got the most power. If we look at the top, then we've got the civil service. Now the civil service are basically the people who do the everyday running of the country, people like benefits advisors, people who write policies, people who sign off your passports, all of those kind of things. So they do like the office work of the country. They have to have three separate factors. They have to be impartial. They're not allowed to belong to a political party, so they can vote for whoever they want to in their private life, but within their public service, within their actual jobs, they cannot be part of a political party. They also are anonymous, so if they are writing a policy on welfare or on health, their names won't be attached to it, because if there were, the everyday people could perhaps find them and not be very nice. And the other thing is permanence. Permanence just means they're permanently in position. So, for example, in the next general election, if the Conservatives aren't voted in and another party is, the civil servants don't lose their jobs. They are not linked to the government, even though they do the work for them. Underneath, you've got a couple of key terms that usually come up as 1 and 2 mark questions. So bicameral parliament, bi meaning two, like bicycle with 2 wheels. Cameral means chamber, so it basically means that our Parliament is made of two houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And then your next one is a by-election, a different type of by with this one. And basically what that means is when there is an election for one area, so it's not a general election or it's not a full council election, it's where just somebody needs replacing. So it could be an MP or a councillor has died, retired or been sacked for some reason and they just need to replace that person. Underneath that, we've got powers within the UK and we've got the separation of powers, and this bit is really important. It's our sort of triangle of power. So we've got our judiciary, our executive and our legislator. Our judiciary is the easiest one. That's our people who make judgments about laws in the country. So our judges, our magistrates, they are completely separate from the executive and the legislator. This is a really, really key important fact of democracy. If you look at somewhere like the USA, their judges very often are voted in. They are linked to a political party. The problem is with that, they can be very, very biased. They can uphold the values of that political party and not judge the law correctly. In this country, our judges are not allowed to be part of a political party. They are completely separate. And again, a massive part of the separation of powers, a massive part of our democracy. Underneath, if we look at the legislator, that just means the power to make and change laws, and that's the whole of our Parliament. So not just the government, it is the House of Commons, the House of Lords and the Monarch. They are the group of people that make and change the laws. We've then got our executive. Now, if you've got an executive of a company, they are the boss, and the executive is basically the boss of the country, so the government, the Prime Minister. And they basically are the ones who put the law into action. The legislator can check up on the executive, so the whole of Parliament can scrutinise the work of the government. The government aren't allowed to just make laws as they want. They're not allowed to change things as they want. They are checked up on. So our judiciary is completely separate from our executive and our legislator. I want you to think about why that's so important. You've then got at the side as well a hierarchy of power. So we look at the top and we've got international bodies, things like NATO, the UN and the EU. So they're international, lots of countries all joining up. Beneath that, we've then got central power within the UK, which is our Parliament. We've then got devolved government, so things like Scotland, their Scottish Parliament, the Welsh and Northern Irish assemblies. We've then got regional bodies, so for example, the West Midlands Police. And then underneath that, you've got your local councils. If you have a look at the far right hand side, then we have got different ideas about voting. So again, you've got to be over 18, you can't be in prison, you can't be held under certain circumstances under the Mental Health Act. And again, you could have 8-mark questions based on that. You've then got different voting systems, and these very often come up as 8-mark questions. In this country, we operate the Firstpastthepost system for our general and local elections. This is non-proportional. What this means basically is that every constituency, all of the seats or the MPs up for election, the person that gets the most votes within that constituency becomes the MP. The party that has the most MPs usually becomes the winner and therefore form a government. However, the Firstpastthepost bit, there are 650 MPs. To get the majority, to get Firstpastthepost, you have to have above half, so you have to have 325, 326 to be over. Sometimes that won't happen. So, for example, in the 2010 election, the Conservatives didn't gain the majority. They then had to form a coalition or a joint government with the Liberal Democrats to push their seats up past the post. The other problem is with Firstpastthepost is that it is actually possible for your party to not get the most votes and still become the government, because it is based on how many MPs you have. So, for example, you could have had a 40% of the vote share, but have less MPs than the next party that might have got a 38% of the vote share. So it's not very representative. The other problem is that if you voted for Labour and Conservatives won, your vote is completely wasted. So there is massive problems with it. The good things about First Past the Post is that usually you get a strong one-party government and you get a strong one-party opposition. So it can lead to a good, strong party, but also it's not very representative. Lots of people argue then that we should have a proportional representation system for votes within the country. Basically what that means is everybody goes out to vote, and if your party gets 35% of the votes, then 35% of the MPs will be from your party. If your party gets 20% of the vote, 20% of the MPs will be from your party. The good thing about that is that every single vote counts, so your vote is never ever wasted. It also gives chance for smaller parties who you might not vote for, like the Green Party, because you might think, oh, it's a waste of a vote. It gives those parties a voice. The bad thing about proportional representation is that very often you don't get an overall winner. Therefore, you end up with a coalition of parties in control, which leads to a weak government and decisions not being made. If you think about prior to Hitler getting in control in Germany, the Weimar Republic had proportional representation, and there could be up to 20 parties in control. So there is a massive issue with that. The other problem with proportional representation is that yes, you're giving smaller parties a voice, but that can lead to extreme parties. So there is an issue with that as well. Alternative vote, that's where you kind of rank who you want to be in control. So if there's no clear winner, then the one with the least votes is discounted. Their votes are then go to their second choice and so on. So that could be an alternative for it. Okay, so if we look at the different political beliefs, then socialism is associated with the Labour Party. It's based on common ownership. So it's not about individual wealth, it's about society in general, helping one another out, providing for one another. Equal wages, fair wages, less discrimination, equality, and all those kind of things. Conservatism is quite obviously linked to the Conservative Party, and this is based on traditional values, traditional gender roles, about owning your own property, free markets, business, and all those kind of things. And then we've got liberalism, and this is a lot to do with human rights and individual freedoms and liberties. Underneath that then we've got devolution. Now very often they might ask you for a definition of this for a 1 or 2 mark question. It can also come up as an 8 mark question as to whether or not devolution should happen more or less. So basically devolution is power given away from central government and given away to either the devolved bodies such as the Scottish Parliament, Welsh and Northern Irish Assemblies, or to local governments as well. So devolution, if we look at Scotland, this is the big one. They've got their own parliament. Even though they're still in the UK, they are still under main control of central government. They've got their own parliament and they have got a lot of powers to govern themselves. This has led to a lot of different arguments. For example, a lot of particularly Conservative MPs have said, okay, if we're giving Scotland all this power, that's fine, but when we're in central Parliament, if we're talking about an English issue, something that only affects England, then Scottish MPs shouldn't have a say on it. It's called English Votes for English Laws debate. So, for example, HS2, they're saying that Scottish MPs shouldn't have a say on it. A lot of people have disagreed with this and said actually that's going to cause divisions, it's not fully democratic, we are the UK Parliament and everybody should have a say. Okay, so if we look at the next bit then, if we look at the economy, you need to know just the different kinds of economy. The first one is a command economy, and this is where everything is controlled by the government. So economy is just like a posh way of saying money. So everything is controlled by the government. For example, your water, your electricity, gas, your railways, public transport, all of those kind of things are controlled by the government. The next one is a market economy. So that is somewhere where things are run by the private sector, so private businesses run things, and the state owns a very limited amount of things. So, for example, in the USA, their healthcare isn't run by the government, it's private companies. All of their power, all of their water, all of their transport is all private companies. It's all about making money and making a profit, and that would be somewhere like the USA. A mixed economy is a little bit of both. So, for example, in the UK, we've got a mixed economy. We have got our healthcare and our police and all those kind of things are run by the government. However, our power is run by individual companies. They didn't used to be. They were sold off in the 1980s. This leads to a lot of different arguments. So, for example, if all of these factors are privatised, for example, our railways, our electricity, these used to be what's called nationalised when the government runs them. Private companies have got them now. But is it more about making money rather than providing a service? What about private healthcare? Now, the thing is with that, if we sold off our NHS, if we sold off all of our schools like we do with academies, that's brilliant for the government in a way because they haven't got to pay for them anymore. There'll be more money in the country to do other things, which sounds fantastic. However, are we risking people's lives? Are we risking people's education? Because they won't be guided by the same principles. They won't have the scrutiny that they used to be. So if we have a look underneath, we can see how the government makes their money and what they spend it on. So the government gets its money mainly from tax or borrowing money. The different types of tax we've got income tax, and income tax you never ever see. It's what's called a direct tax. So if you're working in a job, part of your salary will not go into your bank account, it will go straight to the government through income tax. And if you remember, there are different levels. So, for example, if you earn 11,500 up to 45,000, 20% of your income is taxed. If you earn above 45,000 or 50,000, I can't remember what it is now, then it goes up to 40% and so on and so forth. The problem is that they're not very staggered. So it's kind of like 11,500 and then you pay the same rate of tax up to 45,000 and then they pay the same rate of tax up to 150,000. There's lots of arguments that should be much more staggered because there is a massive difference between earning £11,500 a year compared to £43,000 a year. But that's where the government gets a lot of its money from. Another kind of tax is national insurance, which again is a direct tax, comes straight from your earnings. VAT is value added tax. So that's things when you go and buy something from a shop, 25% of it will be VAT, which goes again straight to the government. Duties on alcohol and tobacco, so they put a high tax on those, helps with the health and all those kind of things and gives a lot of money to the government. Corporation tax is from businesses, and council tax, that's what you pay on where you live. So depending on the size of your house, you will pay more money in council tax, and that usually goes to your local councils and pays for things like your street lighting, your bin collections and those kind of things. So what do they spend their money on? So the military, social security and benefits. Pensions has been a massive one. With pensions, because we are an ageing society, people are living longer. The age that you used to be able to leave work and retire was 65. They couldn't afford the pensions anymore. It was a massive, massive drain on the economy. They just couldn't afford to do it. So there's had to be some big changes made. To start with, they've They have risen the age of retirement, which means people are working longer. What they've also done is put in workplace pensions. So now you have to pay for your own pension. The government do have bits as well, but it will be really difficult to get a state pension simply because the government can't afford it. They also have to pay for things like housing benefit. They brought in something called bedroom tax, which is where if you rented a home and you received housing benefit, if you had a spare bedroom, you would have to pay 25% per bedroom of that benefit. The problem is with that is that you've got a lot of people, perhaps single dads, who saw their children, at the weekends. They got bedrooms for their kids, but during the week, because they weren't used, they'd have to pay that. You might have older people who'd lived in their rented accommodation all their life. Their families had moved out, they'd got spare bedrooms, they were too old to move and were having to pay the rent on it. Led to quite a lot of arguments and quite a lot of people becoming very upset. However, the government does need the money. Universal credit is the new benefit system. There's been lots and lots of issues on how it's been transferred over. Some people were waiting up to 12 weeks without receiving any benefits. However, the government say that universal credit is a better and more fair way of dealing with benefits. Child benefit, if you earn over £50,000, there's now a cap on it. There didn't used to be. And again, ideas of privatising the NHS and education. If they're not under state control, if they are sent out to private companies, the government doesn't have to pay for them. So if we look in the middle, then we've got different roles that MPs perform. So, for example, they have to work in Parliament. If you're an MP, you have to go to central London into Parliament a couple of days a week. You spend a few days of the week in your constituency, in your area. You might have a second accommodation in London where you can save staying in hotels all the time. So they deal with their constituency. You can report anything you want to your MP. They could bring it up in Parliament. They have to talk about issues that do affect their constituency. They go to debates and vote on new laws. And also they might have their own particular political interests and join a group that embraces that. They usually leave the house on Thursdays. They go to their constituencies. They have surgeries, which are like drop-in meetings, and they can meet their constituents. And they can also attend functions. So, for example, they might go and do something at your school or for a local business. They're also allowed to ask the Prime Minister direct questions on Prime Minister's questions. If we look at some of the other roles within Parliament, then we've got things like the clerk, the speaker, black rod, and so on. And you just need to be aware of these. They do come up as 1-mark questions, so just make sure you learn them. A key factor about Parliament is something called sovereignty of Parliament, which means that laws can only be made or changed in Parliament. Now, there's a big issue with this simply because of things like devolution. If we have devolution and laws are made within the devolved body separately, is that taken away from the sovereignty of Parliament? If we have laws given to us from above, so when we had laws given to us from the EU, again, is that taking away the sovereignty of Parliament? Is that even a problem? Is it something that we should maybe get over, or should we make sure that Parliament is sovereign? Then we've got the British Constitution. Constitution just means the way things are put together. Now, the way our country is put together, we've got a monarch, we've got our House of Commons, we've got our House of Lords, we've got a police service, we've got the civil service, we have our judges and all those different kind of things. The way our constitution is put together in Britain is something called uncodified and unwritten. It's not written down anywhere. There's not a rule book that says we have to have a king or queen. There's not a rule book that says we have to have a House of Lords and we have to have police. Because of that, it means that we can change things quite easily. For example, it's not written down anywhere that you have to be 18 to be able to vote. It's not in a big book of this is how Britain is run. So we could change these things quite easily because they're not codified. The problem with having an uncodified constitution is that perhaps the government could change things without really checking on it, and it could give them too much power. If you look underneath, there's then a little chart on how laws are made. What you've got to be aware of is the green paper, which is the first proposition for a new law, so a possible discussion about a new law, the first idea. It then gets the first reading and becomes a white paper, which is where it's a more formulated idea. We then get a second reading where there's a debate on it. The committee stage is when different groups go off and discuss it, research it, look at all the different details. We then get a report on it, which is where the committees come forward and say what they've learnt. That then goes to the third reading and amended legislation. So if, for example, it's been brought up in the House of Commons, it'll get passed over to the House of Lords. They say yay or nay and pass it back. And it goes backwards and forwards until they agree. And when they finally agree, it goes for something called the royal assent, which is where the monarch signs it off. So, how democratic is our legal making system? Remember, the House of Lords and the monarch are not elected. Therefore, you could argue that it's not democratic. However, also remember the House of Commons has got the most power because they are elected, and if they really want to push forward a law, they can do. And the monarch has not said no to a law in hundreds of years. Hope that all makes sense to you. Thank you very much.